Well, another day, another mass shooting in America. This following by 1 week, the NRA holding a celebration, basically, that the city of Boulder, which had passed a law saying, no, you can't have assault weapons in our city, that got struck down because there's a state law that says you can have anything you want. And so a federal judge said, sorry, preemption, all that kind of stuff. And it's amazing. So the piece that I published over at HartmannReport.com today was about the background of the Second Amendment. It was not so that everybody can, any paranoid schizophrenic who wants, and that it appears that that's what this shooter was, 21 years old, telling his sister and brother that people were constantly following him and, you know, they're eating a meal and, oh, look at, they're watching me. This is a clinical mental illness. What is a mentally ill person doing with a weapon of war? For that matter, what is anybody in America doing with a weapon of war, carrying them around on our streets? Is it time to end the Second Amendment, or is it time to at least overturn Heller? Although even with the Heller decision, you can have rules or laws or policy, I mean, depending on I guess laws would be the word, that say, no, you can't have these weapons of mass destruction. These are weapons of war. They belong on the battlefield, and, you know, and we want to have as few battlefields as possible. I think there's a consensus about that. After, you know, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lied us into literally the longest war in American history, two of them, Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think it's time to just say, okay, that's it, enough. And, you know, where do we begin with this? To start out, I want to just, you know, I asked the question, is it time to end the Second Amendment? It's almost the wrong question, because up until the 1970s, nobody was suggesting in the United States that the Second Amendment meant that any old person could buy a weapon of war, or for that matter, even a rifle or a pistol. Literally up until the 1970s. This really the early 1980s, but it was in the mid-1970s. I lay this all out in my book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. If you want the details and the footnotes and the references and the links and all that kind of stuff, it's all over there. But what happened was in the mid-1970s, as I recall, it was 73 or 74, at that point in time, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, was a sportsman's club. They were, you know, when I was back in the late 1950s and I were early 60s, I was in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts for a little less than a year. And my mom was a den mother in Cub Scouts. And the local NRA guy came in and showed us how to use our BB guns. It's funny, I just bought some comic books, the old ones, you know. In fact, I bought them on eBay for my grandson. And he's 3. He's not quite ready to read them, but I got some, you know, the Huey, Dewey, and Louie and stuff like that. And these comic books from the early 1960s, the inside front cover was a full-page ad for a Remington Daisy BB gun for a young boy. And I mean, that was about as far as they went. And you know, I had a BB gun when I was a kid, and you know, they were all over the place. And the NRA was all about teaching you how to shoot safely and how to be a responsible gun owner. My mom had grown up around guns. It didn't, you know, she wasn't all anti-gun or anything like that. My dad was like, you know, he was in the Army. He learned how to use a gun. You know, he joined the Army just before World War II ended. But then in the 73 or 74, in the Rifleman, the NRA magazine, a fellow who it later turned out to be a high school student published an op-ed saying that the reason that the Second Amendment was written was so that if the American government was ever taken over by communists, that the American people could rise up and take down the government. Now, nobody had ever suggested this seriously before. The founders and framers never suggested this. In fact, it was the exact opposite. There are two reasons for the Second Amendment. The first was that they did not want to, there was this huge debate about whether or not we should have an army during times of peace. That ultimately got resolved in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that says that the Army may only be authorized for 2 years. It's the only limit in the entire Constitution on how long Congress can appropriate money for. And it limits the military to a 2-year appropriation so that every 2 years Congress has to meet and decide whether we're going to continue to have a standing army or whether we're just going to do like Switzerland and let the state militias, be our army. Well, that debate ended, with the War of 1812, literally. Nobody brought that up again. And the second reason the Second Amendment was written was so Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, could maintain their slave patrols. So this story in The Rifleman, in the NRA's magazine, was just complete BS made up by a high school kid. But it took on a life of its own, so much so that in the Heller decision, Scalia quotes some obscure Pennsylvania anti-federalist who was an opponent of ratifying the Constitution, talking about, the need for self-defense and defense against a tyrannical government. And here we are. Now you've got millions of people in America who think that their God-given right to a gun is so they can take down their government, and which is what they tried to do on January 6th.